I think you probably noticed already that an in-depth discussion of finance and markets and statism, can't help but include at least the risk of, if not the fact of war. So let's look at a few of the hotspots now and unpack at least my sense of some of what's going on that you may not get in the mainstream. So recently, I think there was a very dangerous situation that you may know of in Korea, where the South Korea, which is an ally of the U.S., and the U.S. was doing military exercises on sea and on land, and very close to North Korea, of course. And North Korea considered that to be very threatening. At the same time, there were loudspeakers set up on the border within South Korea playing anti-North Korea propaganda across the wall or the fence or whatever they have there. And of course, it was obnoxious to the people in North Korea and very threatening to Kim Jong-un, who's the premier over there. And so because of all of this, the Kim Jong-un started issuing threats. And basically, he said that if those speakers aren't taken out, not turned off, and if the exercises near us are not stopped, we'll have to start launching attacks with what he called, quote, our latest weapons, which the world has never seen. So we still don't know what those are. I don't know if they're real, but I'm really glad that we didn't have to find out at this point, because they do have nuclear weapons, as I mentioned before. What happened was there was a 43-hour dialogue amongst leaders from the North and the South that ended up in a ceasefire, and Kim got his wishes, and so the saber rattling, at least for now, has stopped. He made a point of saying that ceasefire was not a result of the talk, but of the South and the U.S. getting very clear that military might, the increasing military might of Korea would be used if they continued to be threatened, and that's what resolved the dispute. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un used this whole scenario to get agreement from his people, not that he needs it, but it's convenient, to increase his military budget and develop even more weapons to go with a 1 million-man standing army. So that's Korea. Then nearby there, in the South China Sea, there's all sorts of saber rattling going on there, and ships threatening each other and planes flying over. What mostly this comes down to is that the South China Sea is one of the 7 top choke points for freighters carrying oil to countries around the world. The U.S. I think currently controls something like 5 of them, and the other 2 they are the South China Sea. Now, the South China Sea is open right now, so they've got free access, but they're very afraid that China will shut it down, and China is very afraid that the U.S. will, in an emergency situation, take it over to cut off the flow of oil from various countries to China. So that basically is still going on. When we were in China, most of the headlines were about the military threats going on from one country to another in the South China Sea. It's backed off a little bit out of the headlines, but it's still a very real hot point. The other, I'll just mention briefly, it wasn't on the list, but the other choke point that's really under dispute right now is in the Gulf of Aden and the Strait of what they call Bab el-Mandab. And more than 10% of the world's seaborne petroleum passes through this choke point. and the U.S. has basically controlled it through dominating the government of President Hadi in Yemen. Well, there's been a coup recently that has taken Abed Rabo Mansour Hadi out of power and replaced him with someone that the U.S. Apparently does not have control over. So the U.S. is partnering with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Morocco, Sudan, Jordan, and others against Iran, who's supporting the rebels, and of course the rebels themselves. So that again is a huge hot point, which goes back to the economics of keeping sea lanes open for free transactions in oil, and the statists who would like to take over all of that in order to control oil, in order to control people. So let's look for a minute at Ukraine. Once again, Ukraine is mostly about the statists wanting to have weapons in place, the U.S. wanting to have NATO weapons placed on the borders of as close as possible to Russia, and of course Russia doesn't want to have that. So Russia has been willing to call bluffs in Crimea and continuing now in Ukraine. Many of you probably have heard the recording. This surveillance thing kind of goes both ways sometimes. Someone got a recording of Victoria Nuland pushing of the U.S. Pushing for the installation of Petro Poroshenko, who's now the head of Ukraine, and the U.S. put him in an overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych. And all of this is to basically suppress the Ukrainian population so they can hopefully control the oil supplies between Russia, Crimea, other states over to Europe. And basically the U.S. Russia is standing its ground. And if Russia was putting in missiles on the border with Mexico and Canada, I think we'd have a much clearer feeling what Russia is going through in relation to this. And this is part of the attempt to antagonize Russia to keep their economy weak and disempower not only Russia but the BRICS alliance itself. So obviously and then there's the shooting down of jets and all of them. They're going to go into all the various false flags, things that are going on. Almost always these things are not what they're reported to be, and they're attempts to make the enemy look bad to justify either sanctions, collapsing their economy, or starting war. And then let's look at finally just at Syria for a moment, because it's obviously a really hot one. I mentioned that Syria was one of those 7 countries that the U.S. had planned to disrupt and take over. I think the key element here is for people to understand that there was a memo in 2012 to the White House that was willfully ignored, and in the report of a former DIA chief named Michael Flynn. And he claims that this was willfully ignored, and he basically goes on to say that ISIS is in fact a U.S. manufactured military asset, like Al-Qaeda, which was originally created by the U.S. through the CIA in order to fight Russia and Afghanistan. But this is a similar situation where ISIS is actually created and funded and weaponized by the U.S., and now there's evidence by the U.K. also, that's meant to distract a gullible American population, and whose inherent violence can be directed to realize U.S. foreign policy goals of destabilization, not only of the Middle East, but of North Africa, and now through the whole refugee crisis and so forth in southeastern Europe as well. All of this to not only control the banking system, take the gold, and take over the resources, but to also open a doorway for NATO to enter all these regions in force as they're trying to do in Ukraine. One interesting note, this is not critical, but I found it really interesting. I just saw this a couple of days ago. The Bill Gates and Syngenta and Monsanto and others, the ones who were pushing GMOs on the rest of the world, they created this doomsday seed vault. It's the largest organic seed vault in the world, under the ice in the permafrost in Norway. And it's saved for a major like nuclear catastrophe or something like that, supposedly. That seed vault was just opened for the first time a few days ago to get certain drought-resistant seeds to be taken into Syria to try to help with the food crisis there. Okay, we could talk, if people are interested, we could talk about the refugee crisis in Europe too, but I think there's been so much coverage of that. I don't want to take more time right now. I want to find out what your opinions are, what you want to talk about specifically.